For months, Marcus Turner kept repeating the same warning, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a steady, consistent tone that made people around him uncomfortable because it didn't fit into anything they could easily explain. He would mention it in conversations, bring it up at work, try to point out small details that, to him, clearly connected into something larger, but to everyone else seemed unrelated, and over time those warnings stopped being taken seriously. They became something people tolerated rather than listened to, a habit they brushed aside, something they would quietly dismiss once he walked away, because he didn't have proof, he didn't have anything concrete to show, just observations and a growing certainty that something was coming, something specific, something he believed could be prevented if people paid attention. But no one did, not in a way that mattered. And as the weeks passed, the distance between what he was saying and what others believed only grew wider, until the day arrived when everything shifted, when the situation he had described began to unfold in real time, not as a vague coincidence, but in a way that matched his warnings closely enough to make people stop and reconsider everything they had ignored. And in that moment, the reaction was immediate: confusion, urgency, a sudden attempt to understand how something like this could happen without warning, even though the warning had been there all along, repeated, consistent, and dismissed. And by the time it became clear that what Marcus Turner had been saying was not just speculation, not just overthinking, but something grounded in a pattern he had been tracking for months, the consequences had already taken shape, because recognition came too late. Understanding came after the fact, and the moment that could have changed everything had already passed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what follows is not just a story about someone being right. It is about the cost of ignoring something that doesn't immediately make sense, and how easily a warning can be overlooked when it doesn't come with proof, even when the person giving it is trying, in their own way, to prevent what is about to happen. Marcus Turner was not someone people expected to take seriously when it came to warnings like this, not because he lacked intelligence or awareness, but because over time he had developed a reputation within his community and workplace as someone who noticed things others didn't and spoke about them in ways that didn't always align with how people understood their environment. He worked in a setting where routine was valued, where systems were trusted to function as expected, and where most people relied on established processes rather than instinct or interpretation. And within that structure, Marcus stood out, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently. He paid attention to small details, patterns in behavior, timing, and outcomes that seemed disconnected at first, but, to him, formed a sequence that pointed towards something larger, something that did not fit within the assumptions everyone else operated under. And because he could not easily translate those observations into clear evidence, his warnings were often met with hesitation, sometimes with polite acknowledgement, but more often with quiet dismissal. And over time that response shaped how people viewed him, not as someone who might be seeing something important, but as someone who was overanalyzing ordinary situations. And that perception followed him into every conversation, every attempt he made to explain what he believed was coming. Which leads to the questions that sit at the center of this story. What did Marcus Turner see that others didn't? Because whatever it was detailed enough to make him certain, yet subtle enough that no one else recognized it at the same time. And was it intuition, a sense developed through experience and observation, or something more structured, a pattern he had identified through careful attention to details others overlooked? And perhaps the most difficult question to answer is whether any of this could have been prevented, because if the warning existed before the event, if the information was present but not understood or accepted, then the outcome becomes more than just an incident. It becomes a reflection of how people respond to uncertainty, especially when it comes from a source they do not fully trust. And that is what makes this more than a story about someone being right. It is about what happens when warnings are ignored because they don't sound logical, because they challenge the way people expect things to work, and because accepting them would require a shift in perspective that most are not willing to make until it is too late. To understand why Marcus Turner's warnings were ignored, you have to look closely at the man himself and the environment he lived in, because nothing about him suggested urgency or alarm in the way people are conditioned to recognize it. He was in his late 40s, quiet, methodical, and deeply analytical, someone who approached problems by breaking them down into smaller parts, examining each detail until it made sense. And while that mindset made him reliable in his work, it also shaped how others perceived him. He was known as someone who could be overly cautious, someone who double-checked everything, someone who rarely accepted things at face value. And in a stable, routine-driven suburban community where most people relied on consistency and predictability, that level of caution often stood out in a way that made his observations seem excessive rather than insightful, especially when those observations did not immediately connect to something visible or urgent. And over time, this dynamic created a gap between what Marcus was seeing and how others responded to it, because he began noticing small inconsistencies that didn't seem significant on their own, patterns in equipment malfunctions that followed a timing no one else questioned, moments where systems behaved slightly outside their normal range, repeated minor anomalies that appeared random until viewed together. And when he mentioned these details to coworkers or family, he did so carefully, not as accusations or warnings at first, but as observations he believed were worth paying attention to. Yet the responses he received followed a predictable pattern. People would listen briefly, nod, and then dismiss it with phrases that sounded reasonable in the moment, telling him he was overthinking it, that it was nothing, that these things happen and don't mean anything beyond what they appear to be. And while those reactions were not hostile, they were consistent enough to reinforce a perception that his concerns were unnecessary. And as that pattern repeated itself, Marcus adapted not by abandoning his observations, but by documenting them, keeping records of what he noticed, writing down times, conditions, and outcomes in a way that allowed him to track connections others were not willing to explore. And as those records grew, so did his confidence in what he was seeing, because the more data he gathered, the clearer the pattern became to him, even if it remained invisible to everyone else. And this shift marked a subtle but important change in how he approached the situation. He became more certain, more focused, and at the same time more isolated, because as his confidence increased, the gap between his perspective and the perspective of those around him widened. And that isolation did not come from rejection alone. It came from the realization that explaining what he saw required others to look beyond what they were used to, something they were not prepared to do. And so Marcus Turner continued to observe, to document, and to connect the details in a way that made sense to him, even as the people around him chose to view those same details as unrelated. And in that space between observation and acceptance, the foundation of everything that followed was already being formed, not through a single moment, but through a series of small, consistent patterns that only one person was willing to take seriously. As Marcus Turner continued to track the patterns he had been documenting, there came a point where his observations stopped feeling like possibilities and began to take the shape of a specific outcome. And this shift marked the moment where his warnings changed in tone, because he was no longer speaking in general terms. He was describing something concrete, something that would happen at a particular time, in a particular place, and with a level of detail that made those around him uncomfortable, not because they believed him, but because of how certain he sounded without being able to present traditional proof. And when he shared this prediction, reactions began to divide. Some people dismissed it immediately, treating it as an extension of the same cautious behavior they had always associated with him, while others, even if they did not fully believe it, began to feel a sense of unease, not based on evidence, but on the precision of what he was describing. And as the time he had identified approached, subtle signs started to appear that were difficult to ignore entirely. Systems that had previously functioned without issue began to behave slightly outside their normal range, small irregularities that on their own could be explained, but when viewed together seemed to align with the concerns Marcus had been raising. And while these signs did not confirm his prediction, they introduced enough uncertainty to make some people reconsider, creating a tension that grew quietly in the background as the situation moved closer to the moment he had described. And during this period, Marcus became more direct in his efforts to communicate what he believed was coming, no longer limiting himself to casual observations, but actively trying to convince others to take action, to review the data, to acknowledge the pattern he had identified. Yet even then, the responses remained inconsistent. Some listened but hesitated to act without definitive proof. Others maintained their position that nothing was wrong, relying on the assumption that systems and routines would continue to function as they always had. And this hesitation, this gap between awareness and action, allowed the situation to progress without interruption until the moment arrived when the predicted conditions converged and the event Marcus Turner had described began to unfold, not gradually, not in a way that allowed for adjustment, but suddenly, disrupting the normal flow of the environment in a way that demanded immediate attention. And as it happened, the details aligned with what he had been warning about closely enough to shift perception instantly, because what had once been dismissed as overthinking now appeared to reflect a level of understanding that had not been recognized in time. And in the aftermath, as people tried to make sense of what had just occurred, the focus returned to the question that now carried far greater weight than before. How did he know? Because what shocked investigators was not just that it happened, it was how accurately he described it before it even began. The immediate aftermath of the incident was defined by confusion and a level of shock that spread quickly through both the workplace and the surrounding community. Because what had just happened was not only disruptive, it was deeply unsettling in the way it forced people to reconsider what they had dismissed only hours earlier. And as emergency responses unfolded and the situation was brought under control, attention shifted almost instantly to Marcus Turner, not out of accusation at first, but out of a need to understand how someone could have described the event with such precision before it occurred. And as media coverage began to build around the story, the narrative quickly evolved from a simple incident into a larger question about foresight, responsibility, and whether the warning itself should have been treated differently. And with that attention came scrutiny. Investigators began a detailed review of Marcus's documented observations, his notes, the messages he had shared, and the warnings he had recorded over time, looking for any indication that his knowledge had come from a source beyond observation. And in doing so, several possibilities emerged that complicated the situation rather than clarifying it. There was the fact that Marcus had access to certain operational details through his work, information that, while not directly predictive, could have allowed him to identify potential risks that others overlooked. There was also the question of whether his prediction had been influenced by interpretation, whether he had taken general patterns and presented them in a way that appeared more precise after the fact. And these possibilities created a framework in which his actions could be understood without assuming anything beyond analytical reasoning. Yet none of them fully accounted for the level of detail he had provided before the event occurred. And as investigators continued to examine the evidence, Marcus was brought in for questioning, not as a confirmed suspect, but as someone whose perspective needed to be fully understood. And during these conversations, the tone remained consistent, direct, and focused on a single underlying question. If you knew it would happen, why didn't you stop it? And Marcus's response did not shift under pressure. He maintained that he had seen patterns, that his conclusions were based on observation and documentation, and that he had no direct involvement in causing the event itself, emphasizing that his attempts to communicate the risk had been dismissed rather than acted upon. And this explanation, while consistent, did not resolve the tension surrounding his role. Instead, it contributed to a growing divide in public perception, where some began to view him as someone who had identified a risk others ignored, while others questioned whether his knowledge indicated a deeper level of involvement, suggesting that the line between prediction and participation might not be as clear as it appeared. And as this divide expanded, the investigation continued to search for a definitive explanation, something that could connect all the elements into a single coherent account. But just as it seemed that the available evidence might only lead to competing interpretations rather than a clear conclusion, investigators uncovered a detail that did not fit within any of the existing theories, something that introduced a new dimension to the case and forced a reassessment of everything that had been established so far. And the moment this detail came to light, it shifted the direction of the investigation entirely, because it suggested that the explanation might not lie solely in what Marcus Turner had observed or predicted, but in something else that had yet to be fully understood. And then investigators found something that changed everything. The turning point in the investigation did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from a broader review of Marcus Turner's past records, something that had initially been considered routine but began to take on a different meaning when examined more closely. Because as investigators went through his notes in detail, they found that this was not the first time Marcus had made a prediction. It was simply the first time one had unfolded on such a large scale, and within those records were multiple instances where he had identified smaller events before they occurred, situations that had been dismissed at the time because their impact was limited or because they were explained away as coincidence. Yet when viewed together, these instances formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore because they showed consistency, not in the outcomes themselves, but in the way Marcus approached them, observing details over time, documenting irregularities, and connecting those details into conclusions that others did not consider. And this shifted the understanding of his actions, because it suggested that he was not making isolated guesses. He was applying a process, one built on long-term observation and analysis. And as this realization took hold, it introduced a deeper layer to the case. Because investigators also found that Marcus was not the only person who had encountered the same signs he had documented. There were others who had noticed similar inconsistencies, similar irregular patterns. But unlike Marcus, they had not pursued them further. They had acknowledged them briefly and then moved on, relying on the assumption that such details were insignificant. And this contrast became one of the most important insights in the entire investigation, because it reframed the situation from one of unique perception to one of response. Marcus Turner was not the only one capable of seeing what was happening. He was the only one who chose to act on it, the only one who continued to follow the pattern when it did not immediately make sense, and the only one who maintained his focus even when the reactions around him suggested he should stop. And in that context, his earlier warnings began to take on a different weight, not as isolated concerns, but as part of a consistent approach that had been validated over time. And as this understanding spread through those reviewing the case, the narrative that had once framed him as unreliable began to shift, replaced by a recognition that his conclusions, while difficult to accept initially, were grounded in something more structured than intuition alone. And this realization led to the emotional center of the story, because it highlighted a contrast that extended beyond Marcus himself. It pointed to a broader tendency to overlook details that do not immediately fit into established expectations, to dismiss patterns that require time and attention to understand, and to prioritize immediate certainty over gradual insight. And in that moment, as the investigation reached its most revealing stage, the statement that captured the essence of what had happened was not one of surprise, but of recognition. He wasn't imagining it. He was noticing what everyone else chose to ignore. By the time the investigation reached its conclusion, the question of Marcus Turner's involvement had been resolved in a way that many had not expected at the beginning. Because after reviewing the full scope of evidence, his records, his warnings, and the sequence of events that led up to the incident, it became clear that he had no direct role in causing what happened. And with that, he was cleared of wrongdoing. His actions reinterpreted not as suspicious, but as attempts to communicate a risk that others had failed to recognize in time. And while this outcome restored part of his reputation, it did not undo the consequences that had already taken place, because the event itself had affected lives, disrupted routines, and left behind a sense of uncertainty that could not be resolved simply by understanding how it occurred. And in that space between explanation and impact, the story takes on a deeper meaning, one that goes beyond the specifics of Marcus Turner's experience, because it highlights the difference between having access to a warning and choosing to act on it. And as those who had dismissed him looked back on the moments where his concerns could have been taken more seriously, the realization became difficult to avoid, that the outcome might have been different if the pattern he identified had been acknowledged earlier. And that recognition leads to a reflection that defines the emotional core of what happened. He tried to warn them, but warnings only matter if someone listens. And within that statement is a broader question about how people respond to uncertainty, especially when it challenges what they believe to be normal, because there are moments in any system, any environment, where signs appear before a larger event takes place, details that seem minor until they are viewed together. And the decision to ignore or investigate those signs can shape what happens next in ways that are not always immediately visible. And that is what gives this story its lasting impact. Not just the fact that Marcus Turner was ultimately proven right, but the way in which that truth was recognized only after it could no longer change the outcome. And in reflecting on that sequence, a question remains that extends beyond this specific case. How many times do we ignore something just because it doesn't make sense yet? Because understanding often requires time, attention, and a willingness to consider possibilities that fall outside of what is expected. And without that willingness, even the clearest patterns can remain unnoticed until they become impossible to ignore. And that leads to the final question, one that invites a personal response from anyone hearing this story. Would you have listened to him or dismissed him like everyone else? And after everything you've just heard, every warning Marcus Turner tried to give, every moment where his observations were dismissed, and every detail that only made sense after it was too late to change anything, the story doesn't end with him. It shifts to you. Because situations like this don't begin with certainty. They begin with doubt, with something that doesn't quite fit, something easy to overlook because it doesn't come with proof. And that's where the real decision happens, not in the outcome, but in how we respond before the outcome arrives. So if someone around you kept warning about something, not with clear evidence, not with undeniable facts, but with consistency and conviction based on what they were seeing, would you take it seriously, or would you wait for proof the way most people do? And by the time that proof appears, would it already be too late to act on it? And that leads to a deeper question, one that goes beyond this story and into how we process information in general. What do you think really happened here? Was this simply a case of one person paying closer attention than everyone else? Or was there something about the situation that made it easier to ignore until it could no longer be avoided? And even more importantly, when you are faced with uncertainty, do you trust patterns, the slow accumulation of details that point toward a conclusion? Or do you rely only on clear evidence, waiting until everything is confirmed before you decide to act? Because the difference between those two approaches can shape outcomes in ways that are not always visible in the moment. And your answer to that question may determine how you respond the next time something doesn't feel right. So take a moment to think about it and share your perspective, because understanding how others see it adds another layer to the conversation. And if stories like this make you question what you notice, what you ignore, and how you interpret the world around you, then subscribe to Unseen Mind Lab for more stories that reveal what the mind tries to hide.